Professor Qazzaz is educated at the University of Baghdad and UC Berkeley. He teaches at CSUS on Middle East societies and culture. He says that's enough. Most of you know him. Welcome.
You see, the shorter the introduction, the better. So there's no expectation now. All what you know, I'm Qazzaz. Before I start, I want to apologize for sitting. I have a problem with the sciatic nerve or whatever it's called, so I'm still limping. I normally stand up and dance around, but I cannot do that. The third thing is that whatever I'm going to say today, I may change my mind tomorrow. The situation really in a state of flux. And God knows whether we are going to bomb another country or not. Now we are bombing Libya, tomorrow we may bomb somebody else. Remember, we are expert in bombing. My presentation is going to be divided into 5 parts. And then at the very end, I may say a few words about Libya. But I rather right now focus on the subject of Egypt. And I see a lot of Egyptian colleagues here. They are ready to challenge whatever I'm going to say. So my presentation will be divided into 5 short parts. The first one, probably the most controversial one, is the American foreign policy objective in the Middle East. The second part, for the general knowledge for some of you, especially I see some student from Sac State, is a short introduction on Egypt as a country. The third part, why I was not surprised that there was an uprising in Egypt. And the fourth part, what are some of the distinguishing features of this Egyptian uprising, which everybody talk about? And finally, whether the Egyptian uprising has achieved some of its objectives or not. It's too early to talk about it, of course, and to talk about some of the challenges which Egypt are facing. So we have a lot of things to talk about, and somebody told me the room is reserved till 10 o'clock. So just be ready, and there's coffee over here. Let us talk about the U.S. objective in the Middle East, and this is probably the most controversial one. There are many guiding principles guiding the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. We can talk about 10, we can talk about 20, we can talk about 40. And by the way, when I say the guiding principle, I'm not talking about what Obama tell us or what Bush tell us, because public pronouncement is not necessarily tell us what really the American government is pursuing. So I'm going to talk about what I think the real objective of the American foreign policy right now in the Middle East, or for the last 3 or 4 decades. And I'm going to choose only 3. If you put me in the mood, we'll talk about more. So we'll see what will happen. The first one, which everybody talk about it, but I think most people don't have an idea about what we really talk about, is that one of the most important guiding principles in U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and North Africa is to control their oil. Everybody talk about it, but I would like to say a few words about what does it mean, why the oil of the Middle East is really important, why everybody is like to get hold of it. And so let me suggest 3 or 4 or 5 different reasons. Number 1, if we study how much proven reserve of oil available all over the world, including the Middle East. And the latest estimate is about 1.3 trillion barrel of oil. 1.3 trillion. That's all over the world. Guess what? The Middle East has approximately 2/3 of that proven reserve. And if you translate that into actual number, is more than 800 billion barrels of oil. Now, how many billion of barrels of oil do we have in this country, proven reserve in this country? Any of you can tell me? How many? Now, come on, guy, give me a guess. I'll not give you an A or an F. Yeah, go ahead.
1 billion.
Well, I give you many, many Fs. It's more than 1 billion. It's more than 1 billion. Let me give you a range between 1 and 50.
45.
Less than that. 30, almost you are right, so I give you A minus for that. We have about, in that neighborhood, 30, 31, 32, 33. Now compare that with a country called Saudi Arabia, which we love a lot, by the way. How much oil they have? 260 billion barrels of oil. That's the official estimate. Why we invaded Iraq? Now everybody talk about why we invaded Iraq. They have approximately 112 billion barrels of oil. That is almost 4 times the amount of oil in this country. And the people who know a little bit about the geology of Iraq, they will tell you probably they have as much as Saudi Arabia. So that's one reason. They have plenty of it. And I can assure you there's no other area can match the Middle East or North Africa. You can say whatever you want to say, but these are what I call the hard facts. There's another interesting reason why the oil of the Middle East is very important. It is very cheap to produce. When oil was discovered in the 20s, it used to cost 20 cents to produce a barrel of oil. The latest statistic, it costs about $4 to $5. Compare that with the US, how much it costs. It depends on which oil you are talking about, the old oil or the oil of Alaska, etc. It could be 15, could be 20, it could be $25 a barrel of oil. So if you are an Exxon, you like to have access to Middle East oil or the Alaska oil. It's all a matter of cost and benefit analysis. So it's very cheap to produce. But there's another reason which nobody really wants to talk about, because that hit us on a human level as a human being. What is that reason? Is that one of the most important reasons why the oil of the Middle East is very important, because most of it is available for export. Did you hear what I'm saying? And I want you to keep that in mind, and tonight when you go to bed, think about it. That most of this oil produced in the Middle East is available for export. The Middle East today produces on the average between 28 to 29 million barrels a day. The US consumes approximately 21 million barrels a day. Now the Middle East, if you study the population of the Middle East and North Africa, if you put them together, they have a population of more than 450 million. Listen to that, 450 million. Yet, which is more than the population of the US, but they consume much less than the oil consumed in this country. We are about 306 million, and we consume about 21 million barrels a day. The Middle East consume only 9 million barrels a day or less. Now, why it consumes less than 9 million? Because the area is considered underdeveloped. How do you measure development? One way to measure development, how much oil do you consume? And we were told in this country we consume on the average about 22 barrels a year per capita. So let's imagine, and all what I want to do to imagine, that tomorrow the Middle East is going to be a highly developed area, which means they need whatever they produce. Now think about it. Do you think we are going to allow these countries to develop? Or we encourage them to fight with each other, and we try to divide them here and there, or what have you? And that's fact of life, by the way. I know we are all talking about humanity, and we love humanity, etc., etc. But if that area, for whatever reason, all of a sudden become highly developed, whatever it is available for export will not be available, and that's going to affect the civilization in Europe, and it's going to affect the civilization in this country and everywhere. So from personal interest, do we let them do that or not? We can talk about it later if you wish, but think about it and let me know about your view. There's another reason why the oil of the Middle East is very important, is those of you who study the oil industry, when you produce oil, you produce gas. There's a lot of natural gas in the Middle East. Iran alone is the second largest, has the second largest proven of reserve gas. Qatar is the third largest country. The Middle East and North Africa combined, their soil contain approximately 41% of all the proven reserve of gas, natural gas, in the whole world. So oil is very important, and that's the most guiding principle. I can argue with you later on that we bombed Libya because of oil, and among other things, not because necessarily we're protecting people. We'll talk about it later. The second guiding principle for the American foreign policy in the Middle East is to keep Israel as a super regional power in that area through both military and economical aid. On the average, and Israel is only about 7 million. This is not Egypt, 88 million. This is a country of only 7 million people, but on the average, we give Israel about $3 to $4 billion a year, plus the other things which go on a private donation. The U.S. allowed or helped Israel to develop the latest weapon, including weapon of mass destruction, and that is the nuclear bomb. The U.S. recently agreed to supply Israel dozens of F-35. The U.S. Army don't have it yet. Don't have it yet. I can go on and on telling you about what we do. Now, the third guiding principle, and some of you in this audience are going to argue with me, and I love to talk, but not necessarily to argue, is that there's a hidden guiding principle in the U.S. foreign policy, is to encourage as much disunity and fragmentation in the Arab world, including also the Middle East. This is not only, by the way, the policy of the U.S., this is the policy of Russia, Europe, etc. They do not encourage these countries to come together. Because imagine if the Arab world came together as federated or whatever it is. You have 320 million people. Now, as a country, do we want to negotiate with a country of 320 million, or do you want to negotiate with Qatar, which has only less than 1 million people? Did you hear what I'm saying? And I can give you a lot of other examples. I happen to believe the U.S. in the 21st century is leading the role to refragmentize the Arab countries. The process started a long time ago. Once upon a time, that area was under the Ottoman. And when the Ottoman were defeated, both England and France became in charge. And they fragmented the area. If you go and read about that period, they want to establish 5 mini-states in what we call Syria and Lebanon. You go and read about it. They succeeded in splitting Lebanon from Syria, but they didn't succeed in dividing it into 4 other mini-states. So the process of fragmentation started a long time ago. I always like to quote my distant cousin, Winston Churchill, which many of you think of him as one of the most smart guy on earth, etc. And I will never forget what he said in one of his meetings. He picked up a pen from his pocket, and he said, with this pen, I drew the map of Jordan. And he never challenged that statement. And to my knowledge, no historian has challenged that statement, which means to be definitely true. When the British and the French divided the area, they made sure that there will be a lot of border disputes. The dispute between Iraq and then Kuwait, there's about 35 different disputes in what we call today the Arabian Peninsula. And he said what they did in Sudan and many, many others. So the British and the French were the leading power in dividing that neighborhood, but the US in the 21st century are leading that road to defragmentize the whole neighborhood. We invaded Iraq for what purpose? Or not only to have oil, but to divide the country into many states. We already right now have practically 2 states. Whether we are going to have another one, I have no idea. Sudan has already been divided, and there's a rumor it may be divided into other more mini states. Somalia has already been divided, and you never know what could happen to do in Libya and in many, many other countries. I can go on and on and on. All what I'm trying to say, in fragmenting the area further, we make them mini-state, they cannot defend themselves, and they are going to ask for the superpower to protect them. And that's exactly what Qatar did, and that's exactly what United Arab Emirates did, and that's exactly what Bahrain did. And we have bases in all these countries, in all of them. Now, I can go on and on to talk about the US foreign policy, but let's move to the main subject. The main subject is really Egypt. And as I said, what I like to do, I like to start the presentation by saying a few words about Egypt. And I think I put down here about 20 points, but I'll reduce them to 8. The first point about Egypt, if you look at the map, and I gave you a map of Egypt, Egypt is a very big country when you talk about lands. And I'm going to give you the approximate size. I have the exact size, but if we say approximately 400,000 square miles. This is not the exact number, by the way. Now, one way to understand the bigness of Egypt, I assume all of you heard about the country of England. It is about 3 times the size of England. You heard about Spain, it's about twice the size of Spain. If you heard about Central America, it is almost the same size of Central America. And if you heard about Texas and California, it's the same size. So it's a big country. There's no question about it in terms of land. The second point, and that is fascinating, whatever I say is fascinating, by the way. The bigness of the land of Egypt is quite a bit misleading. Because if you study the land of Egypt, only about 5% of the land, maybe a little bit more, a little bit less, can be cultivated. And if you look at the map which I gave you, you are going to find that the majority of the people live along the Nile River. And then there are a number of cities at the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. Herodotus, one of the Greek historians, said the following, and he said, Egypt is the gift of the Nile. I think he was right then and probably right now. And if you remove the Nile from Egypt, Egypt becomes nothing but part of the big, large desert of North Africa, which is the largest desert on earth. I'll never forget, in one of my trips to Egypt, I flew from Jordan during the day. Most of the time when I left Egypt, in my trip to Egypt, I come at night, so you don't see what's going on. But one time I flew from Jordan in the middle of the day. And when you drive, all what you see desert, and boom, you see the Nile River, and then you see a lot of people there. So you need to keep that in mind, and we'll talk about the Nile later on in the discussion, hopefully. What about the population of Egypt? Well, I was told by some people who studied Egypt very carefully that the population is about 88 million. But the official statistics, and most of the book tell you it's about 80, 81, 82. It really doesn't matter. If you tell me 80, I'm not going to argue with you. But let me give you an idea about the growth of that population, because that's an issue which we may discuss later. I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember Napoleon. Napoleon invaded Egypt, or if I'm allowed to use Bush terminology, he liberated Egypt in 1798, I think. I may be when he invaded Egypt, the Egyptian population was estimated less than 2 million. By the beginning of the 20th century, it was around 7 million. By 1940, it was about 20 million. around 1970 or 75, around 40 million. Today is 88 million. And the story we were told, within 10, 15, or 20 years, it will be over 100 million. So there's a lot of people there, and about 2/3 of that population under the age of 30, and about 50% of that population under 20. That gives you an idea. Now, when you study Egypt, about 90% of their population are Muslims, but there's a sizable Christian community called the Copts. And if you study the Copts, it is a fascinating community. It's a very ancient community. And the Copts, if you talk to them, they will tell you that their Christian community is one of the oldest. Some of them even they tell you the oldest. It depends how. But I would agree with the idea it's one of the oldest. And the founder of that community is one of the disciples of Jesus. His name is Mark. And there's a fascinating story to tell about him. If you put me in the mood, I'll tell you that later, but not now. And now, when you study Egypt, you talk about the Suez Canal. And that's why everybody was nervous when we had the uprising a month or two ago. The Suez Canal, which was opened in 1869, how many ships go through the canals? Every month, about 3,500 ships. Every day, there's about 50 ships. They carry nothing but oil. And where that oil go to Europe. So it's very, very important. Now, the Suez Canal is a very, very important source of hard currency to Egypt. On the average, in the last few years, they may be making $5 or $6 billion of it. Now, Egypt's an oil-producing country, but not that much. They don't have a lot of proven reserve. I think the latest statistic which I read about it is about 4 billion. Not that much compared to Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or the United Arab Emirates or what have you. And Egypt produce oil on a daily basis. They produce about 600, 700, or 800 million barrels a day, but most of it right now is consumed domestically. In the good old days, they used to sell some of it abroad. But there's something else in Egypt which is more important than oil. They did discover a lot of natural gas. And we were told the latest statistic about that, 77 trillion cubic feet of natural gas in Egypt. And recently they developed it into liquefied gas, and they start shipping it to Israel, to Jordan, and I think to Syria, and even to Spain, I was told. Now, tourism is an important element of the Egyptian economy. In the 2000s, about $4 billion made out of tourism in the year 2000, and there were about 5.5 million tourists. And the expectation in the year 2010, which means last year, to have about 6 to 7 million tourists, and they may generate about $6 billion or more dollars. And the final point, and I think this is a point which I wanted to keep in mind, because I consider this is one of the most interesting things about Egypt. Egypt has a large cadre of educated people. Egypt has about 20 public universities. They have about 20 private universities, and they have many other institutes of higher learning, and they graduate every year hundreds of thousands of university graduates, a lot of them. Somewhere in my reading I read, but I cannot see the reference where I read it, that Egypt graduate more university graduate than the country which is called England. Did you hear what I'm saying? I cannot find the reference. I read it somewhere, but I cannot find the reference. But one day I'll discover it if you challenge me. But we'll see what happens. And these, by the way, that's when you study the uprising, you talk about these people. Because these people, thousands of them graduate every year. They don't have any job waiting for them. Many of them wait 2, 3, 4 years. And even if they get a job in the bureaucracy, they make very little money. And many of them, they have a second or a third job. In many of my trips to Egypt, I have to use the taxi. I don't drive in Egypt. And guess what? Many of the taxi drivers which I came across, many of them have university degree, whether it's commerce or law, whatever it is. And they used to be, by the way, an important source of information for me, so you can have a fascinating dialogue with these people. So from my perspective, I mean, one of the most important sources in Egypt is this educated cadre. And this is why I'm very hopeful about what may happen in Egypt in the future. Now let's talk about the third part. Am I surprised about what happened in Egypt? The answer to that, definitely not. And I told the audience somewhere else, my daughter came with me in the year 2000 when I was there. And she was really surprised to see some of the conditions because I took her in places not necessarily the tourists go to. And when she heard about the uprising, she wasn't surprised either. She said, based on what I saw then, I am not surprised what the Egyptians are doing these days. So why I'm not surprised, and I think whatever I'm going to say, it will be very obvious to all of you. If you study the economy of Egypt, I think the economy was really in shambles. The unemployment officially is 10%. But unofficially, if you add the underemployed and the people who gave up hope to find jobs, and the people who are working part-time, the real employment could reach 20, 25, or 30. It's like when you talk about unemployment in this country. It's officially 9%, but in reality it's more than that. I mean, everybody knows that. Now, about 20% of the Egyptians, or 1 in 5, they live under the poverty, which is $2, by the way. In Cairo, there are billions of people. Cairo population, nobody really knows what is the population. Officially, maybe 14, 15, but unofficially, maybe 18 or 19, 20. And again, I'll not argue with you if you give me another figure. There are millions of people there live under $1. There are over 1 million people in Cairo live between the tombs, the city of the dead. The tourists normally don't go and see that city. But if you know a little bit about it, you will find out about it. And by the way, there's a lot of PhD dissertation taken from Egyptian University about the city of the dead. And on. And I think CBS and 60 Minutes, a few years ago, they have special on that. I don't remember it very well. Now, the middle class, which is the basis of the economy in Egypt and everywhere, is shrinking both in number probably, but definitely in purchasing power. We have a huge gap between about 10% of the population or less who control the majority of the Egyptian resources. You see, these people, they live in a gated community with big swimming pool, and they send their kid to private schools, mainly English or French or whatever it is, and there is very little in touch with the Egyptian masses. Globalization, from my perspective, and we can argue about it, ruined even the traditional industrial practices in Egypt. I mean, I remember going to Khan el-Khalili, is the major tourist attraction in Cairo, to go and buy Egyptian memento. And guess what? Many of them, turn them around, made in China. And I swear to you, and I was going to bring you a set of dimitas with Egyptian theme, made in China. Coaster, very simple, made in China. This all used to be made in Egypt. So the globalization is not necessarily helped the poor people. Globalization helped the elite, the wealthy people, the people who have access, the people with the big corporation, but not the others. The Egyptian economy, until about 1970, was a government-controlled economy. But since 1970, the Egyptian economy had been privatized. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. But the way had been privatized that most of these companies were sold, most of them, to the cronies of the regimes. And that is the problem. And those of you who followed the Egyptian scene of the uprising of January 15, this is really came as a culmination. In the last 3 or 4 years, there's no less than probably 3,000 strikes in the public sector, in the private sector, and in the government sector. So it is not something all of a sudden. What about the political scene? The situation is not really better. I mean, all of you heard about my distant cousin Mubarak was in his job for about 30 years, and he managed to manipulate the constitution, managed to manipulate the election. Every time he's going to run, he changed the constitution and all this business. And the parliament, the election, the last one of November 20th, I think the ruling party got more than 90% of the seat. And the opposition party, many of them at the end decided not to participate in the election because they were not really allowed to do what they were supposed to do. The prison system has thousands of Egyptians. Some of them had been brutalized, and some of them had been misused, and on and on. One of the interesting statistics came to my attention during the uprising is the University of Interior. And that, no, did I say university? No, the minister, I'm sorry, that's a big slip. No, the Ministry of Interior, it has 1.7 million employees. These are not all of them intelligence, by the way, some of them are police, etc. But when you talk about 1.7, that is unbelievable statistics. The foreign policy of Egypt that alienate many people in the Egyptian society. The way Mubarak behaved as the spokesman for the American foreign policy had alienated quite a bit of the Egyptian masses. His policy toward the Palestinians, especially when you talk about the siege of Gaza, and Egypt closed the door with the Gaza, etc., had alienated many, many millions of Egyptians. His policy, by the way, of supporting the U.S. invasion of Iraq in the year 2003 didn't go well with the majority of the Egyptians. By the way, publicly he said, no, he's against the invasion. But behind the scene, he was for the invasion. And that's the same thing, by the way, the other Arab country. All of them opposed the invasion of Iraq, but all of them participated in the invasion of Iraq in real terms. I can give you some evidence later on. Anyhow, so these conditions, which I spoke about it very briefly, the economy, the politics, the foreign policy, all these things lead us, as an observer of that country, that the element of the uprising is there. They are just waiting for the spark. It's like a barrel of oil waiting for the spark. And that spark came from Tunis, when that guy, Mohammed Abu Aziz, committed suicide by burning himself because he was not allowed by the Tunisian government to sell stuff in his cart. Mohammed Abu Aziz has an MA degree, he is unemployed, and he tried to support a family of 5. And at the top of that, the government would not allow him to use his card. So he ignited himself, and that ignited the Tunisian uprising. The Tunisian uprising provided the spark. It emboldened the Egyptian masses to go on what happened on January 25. And again, we can talk about that a little bit later. Now, what is unique about the Egyptian revolution or uprising? There are a lot of things which is really fascinating. This uprising is going to be studied and restudied. From my perspective, I call it a defining moment in the Egyptian history, which means a future historian, when they talk about the history of Egypt, they are going to say before January 25th and after January 15th. Did I say 25th? Yeah, I'm sorry about that. January 15, before January 15 or after January 15. So it's a very, very defining moment. It's a real moment in the history of man and womankind. And as I said, there will be a lot of books, a lot of articles written about that subject. So let's talk a little bit about some of its uniqueness, very briefly and in passing. The Egyptian revolution, as well as the Tunisian uprising and the other uprising taking place right now throughout the Arab country, destroyed the myth. There was a myth in the air for the last 10 or 20 or 30 years that the Arab masses don't count. The Arab masses are fatalistics. The Arab masses are passive. The Arab masses, they listen to power, and the American foreign policymakers should not take them into account. This is the myth had been promoted by the neocon and by the embedded professors, who are many of them, which you see on television these days, like Fuad Ajami. I will never forget in the year 2002, at the end of the year 2002, there was a hearing in the Senate, and Biden was the chair. And he asked Fuad Ajami, he said, if we invade Iraq, do we have to worry about the Arab masses? He said, the Arab masses and the Arab state is a myth. And when we invade Iraq, you will be received by roses and flowers. Yeah, we did, right? That's what he said. And he's the same guy, by the way, you see him now on CNN. And that's the way it is. So the Egyptian uprising, as well as the Tunisian uprising, destroy that myth. The second thing, which is really fascinating, the Egyptian uprising is an indigenous uprising. It's an organic uprising, came from within. It has nothing to do with the people from without. It has nothing to do with China, it has nothing to do with Russia, it has nothing to do with the US, etc., etc. The third point about the Egyptian uprising is that what are the objectives, what are the goals? Dignity, justice, and freedom. Freedom, dignity, and justice, social justice. And in this country, we keep talking about freedom. But there's an important objective of the Egyptian revolution is social justice. Would deal with the economy, would deal with the roots of really what is going on, and it has to be addressed. Now, the Egyptian revolution is a peaceful, non-violence uprising, is in the tradition of Mahatma Gandhi of India and Martin Luther King of this country. None of the participants, to my knowledge, I may be wrong about that, had employed any kind of firearm or any gun. The only violence is perpetuated by the other side, the government and the cronies of Mubarak. Now, the Egyptian revolution is not limited to one region. I mean, most of the coverage in this country focuses on Cairo, Maidan al-Tahrir, on occasion Alexandria. But if you followed the Egyptian uprising in the Arabic satellite, you are going to find out practically in every major city in Egypt. Whether you talk about Cairo, or whether you talk about Alexandria, or about Suez, or Ismailia, or Fayoum, or Asyut, etc., etc. So this is really a national uprising. It is not Cairo uprising. It's an Egyptian uprising everywhere. Now, the Egyptian uprising started as a youth uprising on January 15. We have about 20 of them, but very quickly became millions of people from all walks of life, all professions, all occupation, different generation, young, middle-aged, and young people, people who come from a traditional way of life, wearing the Egyptian jalabiya, or the people who are wearing the Western clothes, etc., etc. And people who are literate as well as people who are illiterate, so it's fascinating. And this is a revolution or uprising is not made by the opposition party, the conventional opposition party. It's made by the youth. And then the opposition party became a part of it too. The Egyptian revolution, at least the uprising, in the beginning it was leaderless. in the sense there is no one leader which everybody look for. We have many leaders, many of them are young, many of them are very savvy in the social media, and many others. Now, the Egyptian uprising are multi-religious, which means both the Muslims and the Christian participated in that uprising. I will never forget, honestly, the scene which I saw on the Jazeera and Al Arabiya and a few Arabic satellites, when you see the Muslims are praying and you see the Christians are protecting them, and you see the Christians are praying on Sunday and the Muslims are protecting them, and all of them, they shout, "We are Egyptian." They don't say, "I'm a Copt," they don't say, "I'm a Muslim," they say, "We are Egyptian." And finally, I can go on and on, but let me bring it to an end, this section. The demonstrators were very well behaved, and this surprised everybody, by the way. Nobody is pinching anybody else. There was no sexual harassment. Not only that, they took charge of themselves. They started forming teams to clean up the area and to provide security. I mean, nobody told them to do that. It's all emerged spontaneously. The masses kind of create miracles. Now, let's talk about the implications. And here I'm going to very briefly address the issue about the U.S. and Egypt, Egypt and Israel, and Egypt and the Arab world. Let's talk about the first one. And I'm going to be very brief. The U.S. and Egypt. It is very possible that the U.S. may lose Egypt as the most important element in its own foreign policy in the Middle East or in the Arab world. I said it's possible. It is still too early to say anything about these things, but that could be the result. Right now, I cannot say that. Right now, I cannot say that because who is in charge of Egypt right now? The most important element are the military council. And who are these military council, Tantawi and the others? They are people who are appointed by Mubarak, and they were colleagues of Mubarak. Many of them participated in the same military activity, etc., etc. But one of the most telling points about the Egyptian army came from Michael Mellon. He's my distant cousin too. Michael Mellon had been interviewed recently, I think the first week of the uprising, by Jon Stewart. Any of you know who's Jon Stewart? And his colleague Colbert? And I'm going to paraphrase what Michael said. You can go and check it if you want. He said, as far as the Egyptian armed forces, all their leaders, we know them very, very well. We trained them. They studied in this country, and we have an open communication with them. And I think he said almost on a daily basis. And he said, we are always in touch with them, that's during the uprising, and we tell them, whatever we need, we are ready to help you. That is the statement, or the paraphrasing of statement by Michael Mellon. So that gives you an idea about the military councils. This is why I say it is too early to tell whether Egypt will be lost for the U.S. as the most important element in their foreign policy in that neighborhood. The second thing which we need to remember is that the U.S., despite what I said about Michael Mellon, cannot anymore think of Egypt that whatever we say to them, they are going to do automatically. Did you hear what I'm saying? That now, after this uprising, even these are our friends, we have to be sensitive to the local Egyptian needs. We have to be careful about what we are going to do with the Egyptian. Now, what about Israel? Here we have a fascinating thing to say. And I would like to very briefly touch about 4 points regarding Israel and Egypt. You know, one of the funny things happen is when you listen to my distant cousin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. I don't know how many of you followed his writing or his pronouncement. He claimed, and he said it again and again and again, democracy don't make wars. Democracy make peace. That's what he said. And I can argue, of course, again that the funny things, when the uprising took place in Egypt for 3 or 4 days, he didn't say a word. All what we know, he was worried, he's mystified, and he's becoming very afraid. And one of the statements he said in the first 3 days, he said, I'm afraid what happened in Egypt is like what happened in Iran in '79. When Iran used to be and Israel was very close, and with the Islamic Revolution, things turned around. That's all what he said. And here is a guy who claimed that democracy don't make war, and we have a democratic uprising in Egypt. He said nothing. Why he said nothing? Look at it. He's very afraid. He lost a friend there for 30 years, and he rather negotiate with one individual than negotiate with 88 million Egyptians. That's where they believe in democracy. This is why I said these are code words, and our president is good at it. The second point, I do not think any Egyptian government, that's my belief, even if the Brotherhood of Islam control Egypt, which I don't think will happen, that they will ever give up or cancel the Camp David Agreement of 1979. That's given, and I don't think they are going to do anything about it. The third thing is the question of Gaza Strip. Without Egypt, that siege around Gaza will not succeed. Now I have a feeling that they are going to open up the Egyptian section very quietly without a big fanfare and without making any things about it. There is something else, is that there was a treaty to sell Egyptian gas to Israel. This treaty was signed, I think, 205 or 206 or 7, whatever it is. And the treaty, to my knowledge, is very secretive, not transparent. And the rumor, I cannot tell you definitely, that Egypt was selling natural gas to Israel 1/3 less than the international market. Now, that treaty is going to be renegotiated, and I can tell you it's not going to continue that way. And the last things about Israel, Israel was dreaming to normalize a relationship with Egypt. The Camp David Agreement is a cold agreement. Most of the Egyptian people rejected that agreement, and they are not cozying up to Israel. They are doing everything on earth, but it's not happened. And even the US tried to induce normalization between Egypt and Israel, and they didn't succeed. And I'm trying to remember, I tried to scratch my head, there was a treaty between Egypt and Israel about free trade agreement. And in that treaty, if I remember correctly, and I hope one of you can correct me on it, they forced Egypt. Anything exported to this country must have an element made in Israel. Did you hear what I'm saying? I forgot the name of the treaty. I can find out for you. I thought I'll not talk about it, but I try to impress you. Anyhow, so the dream of normalization is really gone, for a while at least. Now, what about Egypt and the Arab world? Egypt is the largest Arab country. Whether you like it or I like it, doesn't matter. It is the largest Arab country. It has a population of 88 million people, and almost, not almost, 1 out of 4 Arabs live in Egypt. So that gives you an idea. Egypt is the Arab cultural center in the past and today. If any of you watch Arabic satellite, you are going to see a lot of movies, practically all of them made in Egypt. Not all of them, but many of them. Most of the play are made in Egypt. Most of the famous singers come from Egypt. So whatever goes in Egypt has an impact on the Arab world. This is not like Las Vegas. You see, when you go to Las Vegas, whatever you do, stay in Las Vegas, right? No. In Egypt, whatever the Egyptian do, it has an impact on somewhere else. Yeah. There is approximately 6 to 8 million Egyptians live in the Arab countries. Those of you who are listening to the news about Libya, we were told there's more than 1 million Egyptians living in Libya. I heard even 1.5 million, even 2 million. Jordan, which is a poor country, I was told in some of the readings, have 500,000 Egyptians. There's about 4 million that live in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf country in Kuwait. And anybody who studied the modern education and the Arab world, you are going to find out the Egyptians play a very, very important role in the establishment of the modern education in the Arab world. 20 or 30 years ago in the Gulf countries, all the school system are dominated by Egyptians, even elementary school teachers. What do? These 6 to 8 million, they do everything on earth, from cleaning up the bathroom, to being an engineer, to being a doctor, to being an advisor to the Sultan or the king, the computer specialist, etc., etc. And a lot of these Egyptians, they send money back to Egypt. The estimate could be 2 or 3 or 4 or $5 billion, it depends on which year you are quoting, which is considered to be, by the way, an important source of foreign currency. Egypt during Mubarak time lost its role in the Arab world and also in Africa, by the way. Not only in the Arab world, but in Africa. And I really think the new Egyptian government, regardless, they are going to try to regain that role in the Arab world or also in Africa. So in that sense, it is very interesting. And as all of you know, I mean, uprisings are contagious. It happened when the Soviet Union collapsed. You see the uprising in all the Balkan country. So it started in Tunis, went to Egypt, and now you see it everywhere in Bahrain, in Kuwait, in Oman, in Yemen, in Libya, and in many, many other countries. Now let me conclude the discussions about Egypt and then maybe pick up a few questions, and then if you're in the mood we talk about Libya. Now whenever we talk about revolution, well, revolution is not one day, not 2 days, it's years and years and years. Phase 1 had been accomplished, that the head of the regime, not the regime itself by the way, the head of the regime and some members of the regime had disappeared. And when it comes to phase 2 of the uprising, 3 or 4, there's always going to be disagreement. And that is, by the way, very, very normal. But instead of talking about what happened exactly, let me talk about a few of the challenges which I really think is facing Egypt today. One of the most important challenges, in my judgment, is the population of Egypt. I already said a few things about it. And I would say the following, and I'm willing to argue about it for 20 hours, is that unless and until they control the growth of the Egyptian population, Egypt will have a very, very hard time to cope with the growth of that population. It will have a hard time when you talk about economic development and what have you. I remember in the late 50s or early 60s, I was still in Iraq. By the way, I'm from the occupied country of Iraq. When I remember the president of Egypt at that time was Nasser. And in one of his speeches, and I cannot quote him exactly or correctly, but something to that effect, he said, we are building 3 schools every 2 days, or 4 schools every 3 days, one of the two, but that's not enough to keep up with the growth of population. I mean, do you see the magnitude of the problem? We can talk about it a little bit more if you wish. So this is one of the issues the new government they have to deal with. And I have to say, in fairness, the Mubarak regime had paid some attention to it, and we can talk about that if you are in that mode. The second questions, when you talk about population, you talk about jobs. And when it's 2/3 of the population less than 30 and 50 are, so every year thousands and thousands of newcomers in the labor market, and how do you provide them with jobs? Anybody who studied the Egyptian bureaucracy, they will tell you it's overblown bureaucracy. For each job, they may have 5 people doing the same job. And that is part of the problem. But on the other hand, I have to say, Egypt has talents. Remember I said they have the human element? That's their best treasure they have. And I'm sure if they put it together, they will come up with something. But there's a third problem, and a very important issue, is the Nile River. The Nile River is that this Nile River, the poor river, when Napoleon invaded Egypt, used to feed only 2 million Egyptians. Now the same river is feeding 88 million Egyptians. But remember, there are 9 countries around the Nile, and all these countries depend on their survival on the Nile River. And the bad news is that Ethiopia in particular are attempting to build dams. And if they build the dams, that would affect the flow of the Nile River to Egypt. And this is why the new government, one of the new challenges facing the new government is to reassert their position in Africa and start dealing with their neighbors, start dealing with the other country. Because this is a very serious problem. But again, I am optimistic because I do believe the Egyptians have talents and the human element, they will come up ways, etc., etc. So these are some of the problems with the new government they have to deal with. But let me conclude the discussion. Remember, the Egyptian revolution is only 2 months or less. And you cannot really do any serious evaluation about an event just took place 2 months ago. So whatever I say, whatever anybody say, it is basically tentative. I really cannot tell you in which direction we are moving. There are some indication what you said is correct. The report, for example, came up on CNN about 2 days ago. And there was another report, the singer of the revolution, I think his name, Adham something, I forgot his complete name. He was taken by the military and he was beaten quite severely, etc., etc. And also, recently, the Egyptian government had enacted certain law to prevent worker from going on strike. You can strike, but after work, not before, during the work, etc., etc. So I cannot tell you exactly what's happening, but all what I can say is the following. Many of the elements of the old regime are still there. And I already spoke about the military and who are these military, and they do not represent democracy. They were converted not by choice, they were converted by force. And if you study their behavior, they never acted, they always reacted. They did not get rid of the prime minister until when people went back to the Maidan al-Tahrir and demonstrated again. The people want to resolve the intelligence, and they didn't act until very recently. So the military are in the mode of reacting, not acting, which to me an indication they are not really for the uprising, but they are forced to follow the uprising for the time being. Whether they are buying time or not, I cannot tell you. Well, that's a very good question. I think they will be part of Egypt, and whether you like it or not, they are part of Egypt. But how big is the part, nobody really can tell. The latest data about them, they may represent 20% of the Egyptian population. It could be more, it could be less, but they are a significant number of the Egyptians. Now, my policy, and this is my general philosophy, do not exclude anybody from the political process. If you are going to exclude the Brotherhood of Islam based because on their religion, based on their faith, or whatever it is, you are asking them to be an extremist. From my perspective, when you exclude somebody, you are forcing him or her to be an extremist. And the best way to moderate people is to include them in the political process. History tells us, when you become part of the system, you are going to negotiate. When you become part of the system, you are going to give and take. But if you are going to exclude them, well, they have no other choice but to be extremists. And this is a lesson I hope the Egyptian government had learned, and they will never do that. You see, in our government, the US government, we made many, many mistakes. That when a government elected democratically, but we don't like the government, and instead of dealing with it, what did we do? We boycotted that government. We did that with Hamas in Israel. We did that with Chile. We did that with the Shah of, in Iran in 1953. And we did that in Algeria in the 90s. So if a government we don't like, we better talk to them. We better negotiate with them And if we do, I can assure you they will moderate their ideas and their principles. So do not exclude them. We give the Egyptian armed forces about $1.3 billion, and it's called the biggest pride we ever gave to any other army, besides Israel, of course. Israel is special. And do we buy influence with it? Definitely, definitely. I already told you most of these officers are trained in this country. Many of them have American orientation. I mean, somebody who studied the Egyptian armed forces, he divided them into two sections. The first section, the armed forces of the 50s and the 60s, that's when Jamal Abdel Nasser was the president. And then you talk about the Egyptian armed forces of Camp David. And since Camp David, the Egyptian armed forces is totally American oriented. Weapon, training, concept, strategy, and everything. And the answer to that, yes. They have a very, very huge influence. And I happen to believe, and this I didn't say it in my main presentation, that we facilitated the getting rid of Mubarak by letting the armed forces taking over. We spoke to them on a daily basis. And if you notice what happened, in the beginning the US government was not for the idea of getting rid of Mubarak. We encouraged him to do some changes. And then we sent Wisner, the American ambassador, and then all of a sudden Mubarak said, I'm going to have a vice president. And then when things didn't work out, and we tried to pressure him, the army, to give up, but he didn't give up. Finally, we told the armed forces to get rid of him. So Mubarak did not resign. Mubarak was forced to leave. And who forced him to leave is the armed forces. And the armed forces are the best right now for us. When I say us, I mean the US in Egypt. And this is why I said it's too early to tell whether really this is going to be moving in one direction or the other direction. And it's very possible the US is buying time. We are hoping to get some guys in the Egyptian government who are more or less still in tune with the American orientation. Who are the leading candidate? Ammar Moussa. Who is Ammar Moussa? Ammar Moussa is the General Secretary of the Arab League. He was the foreign minister of Mubarak, and he was very influential in shaping Egyptian foreign policy. So it's still too early to say, but definitely, the Egyptian army is an important conduit to American foreign policy in Egypt, in that area. As far as the food is concerned, I tell you it's a big challenge, and I don't envy the Egyptian government. Whether any new government, regardless of their orientation, it is not an easy job to do. The area, cultivated area, is very, very limited. But there are a project in the pipeline, one of them Fuad al-Bazi project, and the project in Sinai, which is very possible to make Egypt to produce more food that they can't feed their own people. Remember, 50 years ago, Egypt used to be self-sufficient in food. This is only a recent phenomena, partly because of the population growth, partly because of the neglect in the agricultural section. But the Egyptian peasants are very, very efficient, by the way, and their production is one of the highest. So I'm still very hopeful the Egyptian will come up with something, but it's a very challenging task. It depends on the intention of the US, by the way. Did you hear what I'm saying? What is really our intention? Do we really seriously want to have democratic countries or not? The recent history doesn't tell us that, unfortunately. You know what I'm saying? I mean, we may have a lot of NGO, but a lot of these NGO are supported by American money and who espouse basically American objective rather than somewhere else. I will never forget, there was a professor of sociology from the West Bank, came to give a talk in Davis. And we asked her the questions about the NGO and the money coming from the US. He said the US or the American NGO, they came up with a project. We are interested in this project, but we are not interested in something else. We are interested in wife beating, but we are not interested why there's inequality in your country. Did you hear what I'm saying? There's a huge difference. We are interested in wife beating, sexual harassment. We have money for you to do research on that. But when it comes to inequality, when you talk about the structural reasons for the poverty. That is not our concern. That's not our hope. So if our intention is good, the U.S. can do miracles. We are a country of talents. We are a country of resources. And if we put the Egyptian resources as well as the American resources, if we put the American talents with the American talents, they can produce miracles. But all depend honestly on the intention. You see, I mean, you are asking me to, I mean, I don't think our orientation in that way. I happen to believe, I suspect what the U.S. is doing in this neighborhood. I mean, we may do something cosmetic, but we are not necessarily for democracy. Democracy is a problem for the U.S. And I tell you why. Any of you heard about Henry Ward Kissinger? You heard about him? And his memoir said the following. He said, when I used to go to Egypt, I talk only with Sadat. Even if his foreign minister disagreed, it doesn't matter. And twice the foreign minister disagreed with Sadat and they resigned. But what counts is Sadat. When I go to Syria, all what I need to convince Hafez al-Assad and nobody else. But when I go to Israel, I have to convince the garbage people too. Everybody. That's what democracy. And this is why I said Netanyahu is very worried. Is he want to deal with 88 million Egyptians or he want to deal with only one? So this is a serious question. And I am not convinced at this point in time that our intention honestly is democratic. Our intention to have a government which say yes to us, a government which follow whatever we suggest to them to do. They may have an election, by the way. Election not necessarily democracy. They may have campaign like what's going on in Iraq. It's a lot of the shenanigans they call democracy. I don't know the democracy. But in reality, we want somebody who follow our cue, who follow our direction. And until and unless that orientation is changed, I don't see much hope. Yeah, well, the social revolution normally followed, and it's going to take a long, long time. And changing a tradition, it's not going to be a matter of 2 or 3 hours. It's going to be a matter of a long process of unlearning and we know what I'm talking about, relearning. So it's going to be a very, very slow process. As far as the sexual harassment, that happens in all society, by the way. And our society is not free of sexual harassment. If you don't believe me, I can give you some reports, etc. But this is going to require quite a bit of education, quite a bit of learning, and I think the Egyptians are capable of handling that way. I remember in one of my visits to Egypt, I was asked to give a talk about my impression of Egypt. And I said something very strange, and people thought I'm really crazy. What did I say? I said, in most of my dealing with the Egyptian woman, I didn't felt the presence of the Egyptian woman. And one guy said, there's no woman in Egypt? I thought, no, there are women in Egypt. I dealt with them on a daily basis. I went to Cairo University. I went to the sociology department, to other department, and I dealt with them on a daily basis. So how come then you say you don't feel they're present? I thought, if you allow me to say that, but don't take that against me, is that most of the Egyptian women, they wear loose clothing. They don't put necessarily makeup, and they don't put tons of perfume, etc., etc. So when you deal with them as a human being, not necessarily as women. Did you hear what I'm saying? Now, when I go to my classroom, what do I see? What do I see when I go to my classroom, especially in the summer? That gives you an idea about what I'm saying. So the Egyptian women are part of the labor force, by the way, now. More and more people become part of the labor force. Once upon a time, 50 years ago, if you want to get married to a woman, you want a woman who is not going to work. But now, one of the conditions when you get married to find out somebody who can work, because today in Egypt you may need 2 or 3 income to sustain a family. So women are part of the labor force, and there's a lot of contact. In the process, some of these hassles may happen. But I have a feeling they will be able to control. But remember what I said, the social revolution takes much longer. But the good news, we have the political one. And I really hope the social revolution will succeed. You see, tribalism is there. I'm not going to deny that. It is then, was there, it's there today, and will be here for the future. But the intensity of tribalism had diminished in the last few years or in the last few decades. Now, when the Ottoman Empire came to an end after the First Global War, we have what we call the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This is a secretive agreement between two foreign ministers of England and France. And in that treaty, they decided Palestine will be under the British. Syria and Lebanon, at that time, not Syria and Lebanon, was under the French. Iraq under the British. And on and on and on. So what they did it throughout that treaty to divide really this area, which used to be part of the Ottoman Empire. I do agree with you, and I think I mentioned it in my talk, is that the way they divided it, that they did not divide it to reflect necessarily what you said, but they divided in a way that to create more tension between these countries. They split it Kuwait from Iraq. You can argue whatever you want to argue, but I can assure you it used to be part of the southern part of Iraq. And they did that between United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, Oman and Saudi Arabia, etc. As I said in one study which I came across, there's about 35 different border disputes just in the Arabian Peninsula. So what you said, to some extent, is correct. But what I'm saying, they did participate in the fragmentation of the Arab world. And what I also said, the U.S. now are continuing this process of fragmentations. We already did that with Iraq, we already did that in Sudan, and God knows what's going to happen in the near future. I tell you, there's a plan even to divide Saudi Arabia into 3 states. I know you may not believe me, but that is, the story came out before we invaded Iraq, when Richard Perel invited one of the guys from Rand Corporation to come and give talk about Saudi Arabia, and he said Saudi Arabia should be divided into 3 parts. The eastern part, which quote unquote, this is what he used, a Shia Muslim. He didn't use the word Shia Muslim, he said just Shia. This will be a separate area. The Hijaz area will be a separate country, and the middle will be a separate country. There's a rumor that Sudan may be divided further into another 5 mini-states, and God knows. Well, they have many challenges. One of the challenges, they have 2 months of disturbances. They lost a lot of tourists. One of the jobs facing the government, for example, they have to re-establish the trust of the tourists. Tourism is a very important source of the Egyptian economy, and generate about 2.5 million people, about 2.5 million jobs. So they have a lot to do in that direction, and they have to do a lot in the other direction, whether in terms of finding jobs to the unemployed people, whether to improve their wages, etc. These are challenges, and the future will tell us whether this government will be able to succeed or not. And I keep saying, and I go back, the Egyptian has talents. And hopefully these talent will come up with ideas to bring about jobs to the Egyptian. I listened a little bit to Obama's speech, but I didn't listen to it completely, so I cannot really talk about it, but I'll make a comment. Well, Libya, 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 points. The first one, and I think, let's agree, so you will not see anything. From my perspective, let's agree that Gaddafi is son of a bitch. I don't think we need to argue about it from my perspective. You can say he's crazy, you can say he's mad, you can say he's a horrible guy, and on and on and on. Let's agree that his regime is politically very, very oppressive regime. I said that about Gaddafi a long time ago. This is not a product of today. The second point, I think we can argue about it, but that's my perspective. I am against any military intervention, anywhere, for whatever reasons. I do not think military intervention will solve the problem. I think military intervention complicates the problem, create more tragedy, and create more problems. And the recent American intervention in the Middle East testified to that. And I think all of you are old enough to remember Iraq. And if you remember that wonderful phrase, is what they call cakewalk. Do you remember that phrase? Cakewalk? Whatever it is. And now what happened? Hundreds of thousands were killed. 4.5 million Iraqi left their home, either leaving the country or go to somewhere else in Iraq. And if the other intervention in Somalia, what happened in Somalia? What happened in Yemen? What happened in Pakistan? What happened in Afghanistan? These are all American military intervention. Did they resolve the problem? And if you can tell me the problem was resolved? So I am, in general, against any military intervention, whether by the US or by Saudi Arabia or by France or by anybody else. Now, any of you heard about Sarkozy, the president of France? And if you heard about Tunis, just 2 days before the president of Tunis fled the country, the French are sending equipment and advisors to Zayn al-Abidin how to deal with the Tunisian uprising. And he is the guy now, he's leading the process of bombing of Libya. So do you trust a guy like Sarkozy? Do you think this guy has a genuine interest in what's going on in Libya? Now, there's another point which I want to make about the bombing of Libya. Any of you in this audience can tell me what is the impact of depleted uranium? Depleted uranium? Now, we did that in Iraq, and the Iraqi people are still suffering from that. And now we are using it in Libya. And you tell me you are protecting civilian? We are protecting civilian? Now, let me tell you the story about Libya. I already told you Gaddafi is son of a ditch, so I'm not going to defend him. But we have 2 score to settle with this guy. We never forget what he did to us. What did he do to us? In 1969, when he came to power, 10 months later, he asked us to close the biggest American Air Force in North Africa, Wheelers Air Force. Plus, he asked the British to, but that's one score we want to settle with him. And the other score we want to settle with him, and that is a mystery for many people, nobody seemed to know the role of Gaddafi in oil industry. When Gaddafi came to power in 1969, Libya was swimming with oil and money, and he has a lot of money. But you study what he did, he's the guy who was very influential in raising the prices of oil up. And he is the guy who was very influential in nationalizing the oil company throughout the area. How he succeeded to do that? Well, when Gaddafi became the head of that country, he was 27 years old, and the population of Libya was less than 2 million. Just less than 2 million. This is not a big country, by the way. This is what's amazing me. The whole Europe is ganging around a country of less than 6 million today. I cannot honestly believe that, how the president can talk this way. When Gaddafi came to power, Libya did something regarding the oil industry nobody else did, like Iraq, like Saudi Arabia, like Iran. The Libyan oil in Libya was discovered in 1955. And they made a law that they will not allow only the large oil company to be in charge of the Libyan oil. And they divided the country into small lots. And they asked the company to bid. So the big company bid, as well as the small company bid. American company bid, as well as Indian, Japanese, Italian, and a French company bid. By the time they settled the bidding, there is about 50 different companies producing oil in Libya. And some of these companies, they have no other oil but the Libyan oil. So when he became in charge of the government, he started bidding one company against the other. He started with a small company, which have only oil from Libya, and he started forcing them to give him more money for the price of a barrel of oil. In those days, if you remember, a barrel of oil cost less than $2. So the prices started going up. Once he succeeded with one company, he moved to another company, and to the third and the fourth, and on till the very end. And then in the process, he started nationalizing the oil company. He started with a small one, which has no power, like the giant. And that's how the process of nationalizing oil companies started, all in Libya, then moved to Iraq, and then to other countries. And this we never forgave Gaddafi for, including Exxon. Now, do you know one of the plane which, when they go over in the sky, the plane which give them gas, the refilling plane, are called Exxon, by the way. Exxon 1 and Exxon 2 and Exxon 3 and Exxon 4 and all this business. So that gives you an idea of what. So we want to settle these two scores with Gaddafi. Number one is when he closed the air bases in Libya. And number two is to settle the issue about the pricing of the oil and about nationalizing the oil. Because one of our objectives by invading Iraq to denationalize the Iraqi oil. And we are trying very hard to do that, by the way. The Iraqi people said no, but who cares? The Americans are in charge. And this is what we try to do with Libya. So this is the, now the Libyan uprising from the very beginning different from the Egyptian uprising. The Egyptian uprising was homegrown, indigenous, from within. It was peaceful, despite the fact the other side used weapons against it. Now in the Libyan uprising, something very strange. Almost the second day it became military. And almost the second day, you see these rebels start occupying city after the city after city after city after city, and almost they came to Tripoli. And then that's the time when Gaddafi, in his stupid mind, started using violence, etc., etc. Now, one more point or two more points. Now, explain to me if military intervention is going to settle the issue. How? Now, Obama talked about the following thing. He said, we'll never send American troops. But did he ever said we never sent contractors? Did you hear what I'm saying? When Obama lied to his teeth, he said we are withdrawing from Iraq at the end of the year. He never said anything about the contractors who are over 100,000 right now in Iraq. Did you hear what I'm saying? Obama doesn't talk about these things. And this is why I say you really need to go beyond what he tell you or what Sarkozy tell you, or what the Prime Minister of England tell you, etc., etc. So to summarize what I wanted to say, I'm against military intervention. Are there other ways to resolve it? The answer to that, yes. I do trust the Libyan people, and I think they can handle it themselves. That's what I think.